February 2009, West Los Angeles. Clint Eastwood was sitting in a quiet corner booth at Musso and Frank Grill when a waiter approached with an envelope. The man looked nervous, apologetic. "Someone asked me to give you this," he said. Clint didn't open it immediately. He just nodded, slipped the envelope into his jacket, and continued his conversation with his producer about their next project. What Clint didn't know was that inside that envelope was a letter that would lead him to make one of the most significant decisions of his later years. A decision that had nothing to do with movies, awards, or legacy. A decision that would affect hundreds of lives in ways Hollywood would never see. The letter was from Margaret Chen, a 52-year-old nurse who worked at the West Los Angeles Viveza Medical Center. She'd been working the night shift for 14 years, caring for veterans who came home broken from wars most Americans had stopped thinking about. Margaret had never written to a celebrity before. She wasn't starstruck by fame. But after watching Gran Torino 3 times, after seeing how Clint portrayed Walt Kowalski's relationship with veterans and war trauma, she felt compelled to reach out. The letter was simple, direct, no flattery, no requests for autographs or meetings. Just information. "Mr. Eastwood," Margaret wrote. "I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if it matters. But I work with veterans every day who are living the story you told in your film. Except their stories don't end with redemption. They end with isolation, with addiction, with suicide. There's a man here named Robert Milhouse, 61 years old, Vietnam vet, Purple Heart recipient. He's been in our facility for 8 months recovering from a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. His wife left him. His kids don't visit. He has no one, but every Tuesday and Thursday he asks the orderlies to wheel him to the rec room so he can watch your movies on our old VCR, Unforgiven, Heartbreak Ridge, Gran Torino. He watches them over and over. When I asked him why, he said, 'Your characters understand something most people don't, that coming home from war is harder than fighting in it. I'm not asking you for anything. I just thought you should know that the work you do matters to people you'll never meet, that your films give men like Robert something they can't find anywhere else. A reflection of themselves that doesn't look away.'" Clint read the letter that night in his home office. He read it 3 times. Then he put it in his desk drawer and didn't mention it to anyone. But he couldn't stop thinking about Robert Milhouse. Couldn't stop picturing a man alone in a VA facility, watching old westerns as a lifeline. 2 weeks later, Clint called the West Los Angeles Viveza Medical Center. He asked to speak with Margaret Chen. When she came to the phone, her voice was shaking. "Mr. Eastwood, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have sent that letter. It was unprofessional. "You did the right thing," Clint interrupted. "Tell me about Robert." What followed was a 40-minute conversation where Margaret described not just Robert, but dozens of veterans in similar situations, men and women who'd served their country, who'd sacrificed everything, and who now existed in a kind of limbo. Not sick enough for intensive care, not well enough to live independently, not connected enough to family or community to have anyone checking on them. She told Clint about the chronic underfunding, about how the facility was doing its best but constantly running short on resources, staff, and basic equipment. She told him about the rec room with the broken VCR that still somehow worked, about the donated wheelchairs that were 20 years old, about veterans who shared rooms meant for one person because there simply wasn't enough space. And she told him about the invisible epidemic, the veterans who weren't making headlines, who weren't in crisis situations that generated news coverage, but who were slowly fading away in quiet desperation. Men who'd once been warriors, reduced to waiting for mealtimes and medication schedules, and the occasional visitor who never came. "Can I visit?" Clint asked. "Of course," Margaret said. "When?" "Tomorrow." The next day, Clint Eastwood walked into the West Los Angeles Viveza Medical Center wearing jeans, a plain shirt, and a baseball cap. No entourage, no photographers, no press release. Just an 78-year-old man who wanted to see something for himself. Margaret met him at the entrance. She'd expected him to tour the facility, maybe spend an hour, shake some hands, and leave. That's what celebrities did when they visited hospitals. They performed compassion, got their photos, and moved on. But Clint didn't want a tour. He wanted to meet Robert Milhouse. Robert was in the rec room when they found him. He was sitting in a wheelchair watching Unforgiven on a small TV with terrible reception. The image kept flickering. The sound cut out every few minutes. But Robert was completely absorbed, leaning forward, his good hand gripping the armrest of his chair. Margaret approached quietly. "Robert," she said gently, "you have a visitor." Robert turned slowly. His left side was stiff from the stroke. When he saw Clint Eastwood standing 3 feet away, his face went completely blank, not with recognition, but with disbelief. "Mr. Milhouse," Clint said, extending his hand. "I'm Clint." Robert stared at the offered hand for a long moment. Then, with visible effort, he raised his right hand and shook it. His grip was weak, trembling. "May I sit?" Clint asked, gesturing to a folding chair beside the wheelchair. Robert nodded, still unable to speak. Clint sat down. He didn't look at Margaret, didn't acknowledge the other veterans who were starting to notice something unusual was happening. He just looked at Robert. "Margaret tells me you're a fan of Westerns." Robert's voice, when it finally came, was rough, barely above a whisper. "Your Westerns, sir? Only yours. Why is that?" Robert struggled to form the words. His mouth worked silently for a moment before the sentence emerged. "Because you don't lie about what it costs." Clint understood immediately. Robert wasn't talking about movie budgets or production values. He was talking about the emotional cost, the moral cost, the cost of violence, of survival, of making impossible choices. "Tell me about Vietnam," Clint said. What followed was a conversation that lasted 3 hours. Robert talked, slowly and with great difficulty, about his service, about the friends he'd lost, about the things he'd done and seen that he could never fully explain to anyone who hadn't been there. Clint didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes, didn't try to relate or compare. He just listened. Really listened. The way he listened on film sets when actors were trying to find the truth of a scene. Other veterans in the rec room gradually migrated closer, some in wheelchairs, some using walkers, some moving slowly on their own. They formed a loose circle around Clint and Robert, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Margaret watched from the doorway. She'd worked at this facility for 14 years and had never seen these men so engaged, so present. Most days they sat in isolated silence, lost in their own memories and pain. But now they were leaning in, listening to Robert's story, occasionally adding their own fragments of experience. When Robert finally finished talking, he looked exhausted, but somehow lighter, like he'd set down a weight he'd been carrying for 40 years. Clint was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked a question that would change everything. "What do you need?" Robert looked confused. "Sir? You? All of you?" Clint gestured to the veterans who had gathered around them. "What do you need that you're not getting?" The room went silent. These were men who'd learned not to ask for things, not to expect help, not to believe that anyone cared about their needs. Finally, an older veteran named Thomas spoke up. His voice was bitter, resigned. "What we need, Mr. Eastwood, is for people to remember we exist. We're not poster boys for patriotism. We're not symbols. We're just men trying to get through the day. And most days, nobody even knows we're here." Clint nodded slowly. What if they did know? What if someone was paying attention? Thomas laughed, a harsh sound. "Then I guess things might be different. But that's not how the world works. People forget. It's easier that way." Clint stood up. He looked at Margaret. "Can I see the rest of the facility?" The tour took 2 hours. Margaret showed him everything. The overcrowded sleeping quarters, the understaffed nursing stations, the recreation equipment that was broken or outdated, the therapy rooms that couldn't accommodate the number of veterans who needed them. She showed him the waiting list. Over 200 veterans in the Los Angeles area who needed residential care but couldn't get beds. Men and women living in their cars, in shelters, on the streets, waiting for space to open up. Clint took notes. He asked detailed questions about budgets, staffing ratios, equipment costs, regulatory requirements. He wanted to understand not just the problems, but the systems that created them. At the end of the tour, he asked Margaret to compile a complete report. Everything: what the facility needed, what it cost, what the bureaucratic barriers were, what could be fixed with money, and what required systemic change. "I'll have it ready in a week," Margaret said. "I need it in 3 days," Clint replied, "and I need you to include other VA facilities in the area. I want to know the full scope." Margaret stared at him. "Mr. Eastwood, may I ask what you're planning?" Clint's expression was unreadable. "I'm planning to pay attention." 3 days later, Margaret delivered a 47-page report that laid out in brutal detail the state of veteran care in Los Angeles. The underfunding, the neglect, the men and women who'd served their country and were now warehoused in facilities that couldn't provide adequate care. Clint read every word. Then he made a series of phone calls. He called his business manager and instructed him to establish a charitable foundation. He called his lawyer and had her begin the process of setting up a nonprofit organization. He called architects, medical equipment suppliers, and VA administrators, and he called Warner Brothers and told them he was taking 6 months off from any film projects. What emerged over the next year was something unprecedented in Hollywood philanthropy. Not a one-time donation, not a celebrity fundraiser, not a photo opportunity, but a sustained, systematic effort to address veteran care in Los Angeles. Clint personally funded the renovation of the West Los Angeles 508 facility. New equipment, additional staff, expanded therapy programs, upgraded living quarters. But he didn't just write a check and walk away. He was there every week, meeting with administrators, touring the facilities, talking to veterans. He established a transitional housing program for veterans who were well enough to leave residential care but had nowhere to go. Small apartments, fully furnished, with support services and job training programs. He created a visiting program where volunteers, many of them younger veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, would spend time with older veterans who had no family connections. Not as therapy, not as charity, but as genuine human connection. And he did all of it quietly. No press releases, no publicity campaigns, no using his celebrity to generate headlines. When reporters found out and started asking questions, Clint's response was always the same. "This isn't about me. This is about men and women who served. They deserve better than attention. They deserve action." Robert Milhouse became one of the first beneficiaries of the transitional housing program. After 8 months in the VA facility, he moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in Culver City. It had equipment to accommodate his limited mobility, a support worker who checked on him daily, and access to ongoing physical therapy. But more importantly, he had visitors. Clint came by once a month, usually on a Tuesday afternoon. They'd watch old westerns together, drink coffee, talk about everything and nothing. Sometimes they'd sit in comfortable silence for an hour, just two men who understood that some experiences don't require words. Other veterans from the visiting program stopped by regularly. Young Marines back from Fallujah, Army sergeants who'd served in Kandahar. They'd talk with Robert about their experiences, their struggles with civilian life, their own searches for purpose and meaning. Robert told Margaret later that those conversations saved his life. Not metaphorically, literally. There were nights when the only thing that kept him from giving up was knowing that someone was coming to visit, that someone cared whether he was still here. By 2011, Clint's veteran initiative had expanded beyond Los Angeles. He partnered with other VA facilities in San Diego, San Francisco, and Sacramento. The model was always the same: sustainable support, genuine connection, treating veterans as human beings rather than problems to be solved. The program helped over 1,500 veterans in its first 3 years. Men and women who'd been invisible suddenly had housing, health care, community. Suicide rates among program participants dropped by 60%. Employment rates increased. Family reconnections happened. But the numbers didn't capture what really mattered. What mattered was veterans like Robert, who went from watching Unforgiven alone in a rec room to hosting weekly movie nights in his apartment where other veterans could gather and feel less alone. What mattered was Thomas, the bitter veteran who'd said nobody cared, becoming a volunteer himself and helping younger veterans navigate the transition home. What mattered was Margaret Chen, the nurse who'd written a letter she never expected would be read, watching the facility she'd worked at for years transform into something that actually honored the people it served. In 2013, Clint visited Robert for what would be the last time. Robert was 65 now, healthier than he'd been in years, but the stroke had taken its toll. He was in hospice care, surrounded by the community he'd found through the program. They watched the outlaw Josie Wales together, Robert's favorite. When the movie ended, Robert turned to Clint with effort. "You know what I finally figured out?" Robert said, his voice weak but clear. "What's that?" Clint asked. "Why your movies mattered so much to me. It wasn't the cowboys or the gunfights or the tough guy stuff. It was that your characters always understood that violence costs something, that killing someone, even when it's necessary, takes a piece of you, that coming home isn't the end of the story. It's when the real battle starts." Clint nodded. "That's the part most people don't want to see. But you showed it anyway." Robert's eyes were wet. "And then you did something more. You didn't just show it in movies, you actually helped us fight that battle. You saw us. Really saw us. And you didn't look away." 2 weeks later, Robert Milhouse passed away in his sleep. At his funeral, the chapel was full. Veterans from the program, staff from the VA facility, volunteers from the visiting program, people whose lives Robert had touched in the 2 years since he'd left the residential facility. Clint sat in the back row. He didn't speak during the service, didn't draw attention to himself. He was just there, one person among many, honoring a man who deserved to be honored all along. After the service, Margaret found him in the parking lot. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for reading my letter, for caring, for doing something." Clint shook his head. "I should be thanking you. You showed me something I needed to see. That making movies about veterans isn't enough if real veterans are suffering while I'm cashing the checks. The program you created has helped so many people," Margaret continued. "You changed lives." "No," Clint said. "Robert changed lives. Thomas changed lives. All those men and women who decided to keep fighting, to build community, to show up for each other. I just removed some of the barriers that were in their way." "That's everything," Margaret said. Clint was quiet for a moment, looking at the chapel where Robert's flag-draped casket still rested. "It's a start. But there are thousands more. Tens of thousands. Men and women who served and came home to nothing, who are still waiting for someone to notice they exist." "So we keep going," Margaret said. "We keep going," Clint agreed. The Eastwood Veterans Initiative, as it eventually became known, continued to expand. By 2015, it was operating in 12 cities across California and had begun partnership programs in other states. The model remained consistent: sustainable support, genuine human connection, treating veterans as individuals rather than statistics. Clint remained personally involved, though always behind the scenes. He visited facilities, met with veterans, attended funerals of men and women who'd become part of the program's extended family. He never used these visits for publicity, never allowed photographers, never turned suffering into a photo opportunity. In 2016, a journalist from the Los Angeles Times finally tracked down the full story of the program and published a comprehensive feature. The article detailed the scope of the initiative, the number of veterans helped, the lives saved. When asked for comment, Clint's response was characteristically brief. "Some things are more important than movies. These men and women are more important than movies. I just wish I'd understood that sooner." The article mentioned Robert Milhouse, the veteran who'd started it all by watching westerns in a VA rec room. It included a photo of Robert from his time in the transitional housing program, smiling at a movie night he'd organized for other veterans. Thomas, the bitter veteran who'd become a volunteer, was quoted in the article. "Clint showed us something we'd forgotten, that we weren't just warriors. We were human beings. and human beings deserve to be seen, to be heard, to matter. He gave that back to us, not with words, with action. Today, the Eastwood Veterans Initiative continues to operate. It's funded by residuals from Clint's films, by private donations, by partnerships with other veteran organizations. Over 5,000 veterans have been helped through various programs. The West Los Angeles Vive facility has a small plaque near the rec room where Clint first met Robert Milhouse. It reads, "In honor of Robert Milhouse, USMC, and all veterans who reminded us that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off." February 2009. There's another plaque, less official, that hangs in the office of the program coordinator. It's a quote from Clint, spoken during a private meeting with staff in 2012. "We don't do this for recognition. We don't do this to feel good about ourselves. We do this because it's right, because these people served when we needed them, and now we serve them. Simple as that." Margaret Chen retired from the VA in 2018. She spent her last decade working closely with the Eastwood Initiative, coordinating care, connecting veterans with resources, building the infrastructure that allowed the program to scale. At her retirement party, she told a room full of veterans and volunteers about the day she wrote a letter to Clint Eastwood. About how she'd almost thrown it away a dozen times, convinced it would never be read, that it wouldn't matter. "I wrote that letter," Margaret said, "because I was tired of watching good men fade away in silence. I didn't expect anything to come of it. I certainly didn't expect what actually happened. Robert Milhouse used to say that Clint's movies showed him the truth about war. But what Clint actually did was show all of us the truth about humanity. That caring isn't complicated. It's just paying attention. It's just showing up. It's just refusing to look away when it's easier to do so." The letter that started everything is now framed in the main office of the Eastwood Veterans Initiative. It hangs next to photos of Robert, Thomas, and hundreds of other veterans whose lives were changed by a program that began with one nurse's desperate attempt to make someone see what she was seeing every day. Clint Eastwood turned 93 in 2023. He's still making films, still working, still doing what he's always done. But those who know him best will tell you that the work he's most proud of has nothing to do with box office numbers or Academy Awards. It has to do with Tuesday afternoons in Culver City, watching westerns with a Vietnam veteran who needed to know someone cared. It has to do with a rec room in a VA facility where men gather to watch movies and remember they're not alone. It has to do with a nurse who wrote a letter and a director who read it and understood that some stories demand more than just being told on screen. They demand being lived in the real world. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, when VA facilities were locked down and veterans were more isolated than ever, the Eastwood Initiative adapted. They set up video calling systems so volunteers could still check in with veterans. They delivered tablets to those who didn't have technology. They made sure that even in lockdown, no veteran had to be alone. Clint personally called dozens of veterans during that time, not as a celebrity making morale calls, but as someone checking on friends. "How are you doing? What do you need? I'm here if you want to talk." One of those calls went to a 71-year-old Marine named Daniel, who'd been part of the program for 5 years. Daniel later told his daughter, "Mr. Eastwood called me 3 times during lockdown, just to talk. About movies, about life, about nothing in particular." He didn't have to do that. He's Clint Eastwood. He could be doing anything. But he chose to spend an hour on the phone with me. Do you know what that means? To be seen like that? To matter to someone like that? That's the real story. Not the movies, not the awards, not the fame. But the quiet decision to pay attention, to see people who've been invisible, to understand that heroism isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's just showing up, week after week, year after year, without cameras, without recognition, without anything except the knowledge that it's the right thing to do. The story of Clint Eastwood and the veterans he's helped isn't a Hollywood ending. It's an ongoing story being written every day by volunteers who visit, by staff who care, by veterans who found community and purpose. It started with a letter from a nurse who believed someone should know that veterans were suffering in silence. It continued with a director who read that letter and decided silence wasn't acceptable. And it endures because some people understand that real strength isn't about how tough you appear. It's about how willing you are to be soft, to be present, to give a damn about people the world has forgotten. Robert Milhouse never got to see most of Clint's later films, but he got to see something more important: proof that the themes in those films, the ideas about honor and redemption and showing up for people who need you, could actually exist in the real world. That on a Tuesday afternoon, a 78-year-old director might sit in a rec room with a broken VCR and watch a Western with a veteran who'd been waiting his whole life for someone to understand that coming home from war is the hardest battle of all. And that understanding that, really understanding it, meant more than any movie ever could.